Muy buenas tardes y bienvenidos al canal de YouTube del Centro Sefarad-Israel. Bienvenidos a una de las actividades que organizamos en el marco de nuestra programación. Como saben, el Centro Sefarad es una institución de diplomacia pública que depende del Ministerio de Exteriores, la Comunidad de Madrid y el Ayuntamiento de Madrid, cuyo propósito es servir de puente entre España y el mundo judío. Y lo hacemos a través de actividades como la que hoy nos trae aquí, esta conversación con el cineasta estadounidense Lex Gillespie. Lex, bienvenido al canal de Centro Sefarad-Israel.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Es un placer para nosotros tenerte aquí, Lex. Lex es, como decíamos, periodista, tiene una larga trayectoria en radio y en televisión y más recientemente ha sido el autor de un documental que la verdad nos ha dejado bastante impresionados, que se llama The Mambonics. Es un documental que muy pronto van a poder ver concretamente en la programación de la Casa de América y en un evento organizado, del que muy pronto les informaremos, organizado conjuntamente entre la Casa de América y el Centro Sefarad-Israel. Además de Mambonics, está trabajando en otro documental, del que luego hablaremos largo y tendido, que además da título un poco a la charla que hoy nos trae aquí, que se llama The Catskills. Hoy precisamente vamos a hablar de esa vida judía en los Catskills, esta zona de las afueras de Nueva York que sirvió de veraneo para muchas de las comunidades judías neoyorquinas. De eso también trata de Mambonics, precisamente, de cómo era la vida musical, digamos, en estos complejos donde veraneaban las comunidades judías, especialmente de la ciudad de Nueva York. Lex, si te parece, antes de comenzar con esta conversación, vamos a permitir que el público vea un pequeño teaser de esa película en la que estás trabajando y que muy pronto verá la luz y que esperamos que la vea también en Centro Sefarad-Israel, que se llama The Catskills.
This is quite a landmark, right? Never to be the same again. And many people went through these gates.
From the 1920s up until the 1980s, the Catskills, the Borscht Belt, was the playground for Jewish people. The Catskills had something for everybody.
New York State is a vacation paradise. There's everything from horseback riding to swimming in the Catskills, to say nothing of the beautiful countryside, the lakes and streams.
Smell the air. Smell it.
I'll smell it. You satisfied?
Jewish people flocked up there because earlier there was nothing for the Jewish people to go to, so they created their own.
The Catskills had the greatest concentration of resort hotels the world has ever seen.
Beverly Country Club, Fallsview, Granite, Rolling, Tamarack, Kutcher's Country Club.
We have people who've been coming here 50 years.
Sinuses, walking in place. Everything. Don't be scared. Enjoy life.
We met all the celebrities, all the big stars used to come.
Elizabeth Taylor, King George, Winston Churchill, they all stayed at these hotels.
This is the place. This is the nightclub. This is where all the excitement took place.
The Catskills were like a comedy college, like a breeding ground for comedians.
Alan King's entire routine consisted of simply reading the obituaries. The punchline to each one was, survived by his wife.
The food was endless.
We had belly locks, Nova Scotia locks, regular herring, Machias herring.
Everybody would complain about the food. Oh, the food stinks, and the portions are so small.
If I look at all these trees, there's not a building, not a shred of anything left. It was a time. Never happened before and probably will never happen again.
Bueno, pues aquí hemos podido ver un pequeño teaser de esta película que muy pronto verá la luz, de Lex Gillespie, que se llama The Catskills. Lex, es muy posible que mucha gente que nos sigue desde diferentes partes del mundo no sepa qué eran los Catskills. Así que, ¿qué te parece si comenzamos preguntándote o pidiéndote que nos expliques qué eran los Catskills neoyorquinos? ¿Cómo era este lugar?
Sure. The Catskills are located about 2 hours drive from New York City, north of New York City. They are very old mountains, so they're not like the really dramatic peaks that you would see, I guess, in the western part of Spain. You wouldn't see these craggly peaks. They're very much like gentle rolling hills. Originally, they were populated by indigenous people, Native Americans, and then for centuries. And then the people from Europeans arrived. And after the country, the United States, was formed, the Catskills were kind of like the frontier. They were the wilds, and they captured the imaginations of people living in New York City. And these people wanted to go on vacation and see what this life was like, because they considered Native Americans to be very exotic. And there were books written about this, James Fenimore Cooper's books about this wild region. And so the people from New York built these grand, big hotels, big, gigantic palaces. But the people who went there were Christian. And part of the, originally part of the requirement was that you go to these places and you go to church on Sundays, a Christian Protestant church. So they were very anti-Semitic. They would not allow Jewish people to stay there at all. And these were very popular resorts for a long time, until the country, America, started moving further west. And there were more resorts out in Yellowstone, for example, and the really kind of crazy national parks that we had in the west part of the United States. So around the turn of the century, around the year 1900, a lot of these resorts were closing down. And people from the cities, there were a couple things going on. There was a very large Jewish community that had formed in New York because of the immigration that took place in the late 1800s. And people from the city, there are two things going on. One of them was there was a pandemic of tuberculosis. So it was thought if people went to the countryside, they could breathe the fresh air and they would be revived, they would be cured of the tuberculosis. It's not really true, but people thought that. So there were these places in the Catskills and also in the other mountains of New York, the north of there, called the Adirondacks, where there were these sanitariums that drew people. But the people who still were there were not wanting to have anyone. They were who were Jewish or who had tuberculosis. They would have these signs that said no consumptives, which meant people who had tuberculosis, or Hebrews allowed. But when these places things started to change, because these regions weren't as popular as they once were. And so these hotels were sold, and the people who bought them were generally Jewish. And also what was going on because of the immigration of Jews to New York City, a lot of people, it was very crowded. It was hot in the summertime. So they wanted an escape. And people who maybe back in Europe had farmed, Jewish people, they decided to open up farms up in the Catskills region. The problem is that in that area, there's lots of rocks. So farming was very difficult. And so these farmers, these Jewish farmers, started taking on boarders. And they would have a farmhouse, and they would the wife would prepare meals, and people would stay there for the weekend or a week in the summertime to escape the heat of New York City. This became so popular that these farmers started to build resorts. And the Catskills was born. The Jewish Catskills was born. And this was in the 1920s that things really started to take off. But it was then we had the Depression and the World War, and it was really after World War II, the 1950s, that the Catskills really hit its peak. There were some 500 hotels. There were 50,000 bungalows. These are small communities of houses for families, and the families would spend their summers there, all Jewish, very Jewish area. As many as 1 million people went there every summer at its peak around the 50s, in the mid 1950s. And that lasted until around the year 2000 or so. And things, just like they changed before in the Catskills, things changed again. And all this area, it's now a bygone era now, the Jewish Catskills. A lot of the resorts have been knocked down or just are vacant. You can travel all around the countryside and see some of them that are still there, covered in plants and vegetation. It's really just a very sad, bittersweet kind of bygone era that had its day and then went away.
Es muy interesante, Lex, lo que nos cuentas. Claro, el ambiente que se creó en los Catskills por parte de las comunidades judías ayudó muchísimo a mantener la cultura judía y a esa convivencia entre las propias comunidades, pero también ocurrió algo que tú cuentas muy bien en The Mambonics, que fue ese encuentro con la cultura latina, más bien con la música latina, con el mambo concretamente, ¿no? A mí me gustaría que nos hablaras de cómo era ese ambiente y cómo fue ese encuentro con la música latina, que por cierto, aquí en España lo hemos podido ver en alguna serie, como puede ser The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, de la que hemos hablado también en este canal en repetidas ocasiones, pero me gustaría que nos hablaras un poco de cómo fue ese encuentro con la música latina.
Sure. Well, I think that there's a couple reasons to explain what had happened. In 1919, in America, there was prohibition had begun, meaning that you could not buy alcohol in anywhere. There were no bars. There were no. You would only buy it illegally through mobsters, through these Al Capone. So travel to the island of Cuba, which is 90 miles or so south of Florida, started. And there were Jewish people who went on vacation to Florida, to Cuba. And this is where they first heard Latin music. And really started, this was pre-mambo. The mambo really is 1950s again. But before that, there was a dance called the rumba, which was very, very popular, very similar to the mambo. It's, if you're a dancer, you can tell the difference. I don't know if most people can, but the rumba was very popular back then. And I think that's how the first people got their taste of the music. And also because Miami Beach was so close, a lot of the music came there. And Miami Beach was a huge destination for Jewish people. Again, because of anti-Semitism in Miami Beach, there was only a certain section of the city where Jewish people could be. There were restrictive covenants on things like opening up. If you went north of one street in Miami Beach, it was Christian, and south of that was Jewish. So that became a very popular destination place, especially in the winter, for Jewish people from New York. And because of its proximity to Cuba, a lot of the music came over there. Eventually, it all worked its way up to New York. And I think a lot of Jewish people got exposed to mambo because they lived in neighborhoods adjacent to Latino neighborhoods. People from Cuba, but mostly people in the 1950s from Puerto Rico came to the United States. And then I think the Catskills played a big role too, because I think it was in 1944 or so, the first Latin bands came to the Catskills. And I think there were kids that were, teenagers couldn't go to nightclubs in New York City unless they somehow faked an ID. So they would hear the music because they'd be staying at a hotel with their parents. And this music, the mambo really came of age, or really became popular right at the same time of Elvis Presley. And Elvis Presley was in Memphis, which is in the southern part of the United States, and the mambo was in New York City. And I always think there's kind of a kinship there. The mambo was almost rock and roll for Jewish kids living in New York City at the time. It was very exciting. It had a fast rhythm to it. It was different than the big band music, the jazz big band music that their parents had listened to. So much like rock and roll, which was appealed to the younger people then, I think the mambo really caught on in the neighborhoods, Jewish neighborhoods of New York, because it was just an exciting new music that people could dance to, and you could dance close. Men and women could dance very close together with the mambo, and it was sexy, and it was very appealing to young kids. So I think it's complicated, but I think for all those reasons, the mambo really became popular in the Jewish community, and certainly took off in the Catskills. They had mambo nights and all kinds of dances. Every hotel each night of the week had mambo dances. You would go to the Raleigh Hotel on Monday night, for example, and the hotels would have two bands. They would have a band that played American popular music, and they would have a Latin band. And the Latin band would be in residency the whole summer. And so if you were a mambo Nick, you would be in heaven if going to the Catskills in the summertime, because the music was just part of the whole scene.
Sí, de hecho, el Lex, muy poca gente sabe. Bueno, yo tengo que decir que lo aprendí gracias a tu documental, gracias a The Mambonics, que la historia de Dirty Dancing, la popular película, está inspirada, de hecho podemos ver a su autora en The Mambonics, está inspirada en esta vida en los Catskills, ¿no? En estos complejos veraniegos y en los famosos concursos de baile. También hay algo que llama mucho la atención, y es que tú cuentas muy bien cómo estas comunidades judías llegaban incluso a cambiarse los nombres para adaptarse y que parecieran nombres latinos, y participar así en estos concursos, ¿no? Y eso es realmente muy cómico, ¿no? Como alguien que se llama Cohen de repente se llama Miguel o una cosa así, ¿no? Se adaptan a esos nombres al mundo latino, ¿no? ¿Cómo eran estos concursos? ¿En qué consistían?
Well, they had something in the Catskills that was distinctive to the Catskills called a champagne hour. And so every hotel would have a champagne hour, I guess every night, and it would be basically a dance contest. And, these hotels, just like in Dirty Dancing, the hotels had dance instructors, and dancing was a big, my parents weren't mambo nicks, but they danced a lot. And dancing was very big in American culture back then. Even if you didn't dance mambo, you would dance to big bands like my parents did. But in the Catskills, there were dance instructors at every hotel, like the Grossingers. And that is where the inspiration for Dirty Dancing came, is a hotel called Grossingers. And Eleanor Bergstein, who was the writer of the film, went there with her parents. And just like in the film, her father was a doctor. Her sister was a little kind of crazy, just like the movie. And so she got exposed to the Latin music at Grossinger's, which is one of the kind of the landmark hotels of the Catskills. She became a mambo nick. Eleanor Bergstein became a mambo nick in the Catskills. And that years later, she drew upon her experiences there with the dance teachers and dancing mambo. And she, in the interview I did with her, she talked about how she would be 12 years old and she took dancing lessons at Grossinger's, and she would win the bottle of champagne, which is why they call it a champagne hour. You would win a bottle of champagne. And she said, well, I just gave that to my parents, But yes, Dirty Dancing, the film, came from the Catskills.
La verdad es que ese ambiente que nos cuentas era fantástico, ¿no? Y la verdad, por lo que podemos ver en The Mambonics, pues tenía que ser sumamente estimulante pasar unos veranos en estos complejos, ¿no? Hay algo muy curioso y es que tú hablas para este trabajo con personas que, bueno, que vivieron esos veranos, que disfrutaron mucho de esas competiciones de baile y que todavía hoy mantienen, estas personas de diferentes comunidades judías de Nueva York, mantienen esa afición por los bailes latinos. No sé, ¿cómo tú has podido ver que ellos recuerdan aquellos veranos y qué significa y qué simboliza para ellos la música latina, para estas comunidades judías o para estos miembros de estas comunidades judías?
Latin music really got into their soul. It became part of their identity. Many of these people, Jewish people who lived and worked in New York, many of them worked in the garment industry, they have retired. They would go to the Catskills in the summer. They would go to a nightclub called the Palladium, which is right in the heart of New York City, right at Times Square. Not there anymore, but they would go to the Palladium on Wednesday nights. Was a big night. But a lot of these people, people have passed on. It was a few years ago, but there are still many Mambonics alive who move, like many Jewish people in America, moved to Florida, which is the southern state. The weather is a lot warmer there year round. You don't get any snow like you do up in the north. So these people in retirement go to dance clubs in Florida. One of them is called the Gold Coast Ballroom, which was in my film. And every Sunday night, it's Mambo night there, and it's the old timers from New York, all Jewish, who or 99% Jewish, at least, who went to a lot of Italians too in New York City. For some reason, Jewish people and Italians have a lot of bonds, at least in the United States. And so there were Jews and Italians dancing the mambo in New York during its heyday. But nowadays they've all retired, and the saying "dancing keeps you young." I think it's proof. My film is proof of that, because a lot of people are still in great shape, and doing cardiovascular dancing has made them very healthy. And this dancing became their identity. And the film was easy for me to make because I found them all there at the Gold Coast Ballroom. And you really just have to sit them down and turn on the microphone and the camera and have them tell stories, and they'll tell you stories, they'll bend your ear off or whatever. So this music really, and the music and the dancing really became how they identified themselves. And, it's a great thing to have a passion in life. And I think that's proof of it too.
Lo hemos dicho antes, Lex, muy pronto el público español va a poder ver tu documental en el cine de la Casa de América, en una proyección que haremos conjuntamente Casa de América y Centro Sefarad-Israel, pero para que nuestro público pueda ver de qué estamos hablando, de este documental de Mambonics, si te parece vamos a ver también el tráiler de Mambonics para que puedan hacerse una idea de esta vida en los Catskills y de qué estamos hablando.
Mambo was very, very sexy dance. It was hot, hot, hot. And the minute you heard that beat, you were dancing.
Oh my God, when you got off the floor.
Everybody said, what is mambo? Where is it being done?
This was Cuba, a land of song and dance and gaiety.
I want to be here in Habana. I want to listen to the music. I want to feel the waves.
Almost got drowned, but as long as they play music, I can get drowned.
Latin music was born in Africa, came through Cuba, got mixed in with New York bebop and jazz.
This is a mambo party off Broadway.
You had Jewish people, Puerto Ricans, black people.
They didn't care what color you were. If you knew how to dance, you were accepted.
Welcome to Florida, the home of the Mambo Nicks.
Mambo Nick. You know where the word comes from? In Yiddish is the expression nudnik, who somebody insists upon being a pain in the neck. A mambo nick is someone who insists upon dancing mambo.
Come here, mira aquí, oye, muchacha.
The Latin music had such a feeling to it that it appealed to the Jewish soul.
Even Tito Puente said, I want you to watch my Jewish friends because they know how to dance.
The guy said, what's a nice Jewish boy like you doing in a shirt like that?
La verdad es que es fantástico. Me encanta todavía oír esta anécdota de una de las participantes hablando de cómo Tito Puente, ¿no? Decía, quiero ver a mis amigos judíos bailando, y la verdad es un encuentro bastante singular entre la música latina y las comunidades judías. Lex, a mí me gustaría preguntarte también, antes lo has mencionado, pero quería que hablásemos un poquito más del Palladium. De este lugar, de la Quinta Avenida de Nueva York, esta especie de discoteca, de sala de baile, donde se bailaba esta música latina por parte de las comunidades judías, pero también donde había una mezcla cultural muy importante, ¿no? Porque había hispanos, había judíos, había inmigrantes latinos recién llegados. Era una mezcla bastante plural en un momento de Estados Unidos en el que, pues bueno, el racismo, digamos, estaba presente en la sociedad. No sé cómo podrías describir o describirnos este encuentro, esta convivencia en un lugar como el Palladium.
Sure. Yes, the Palladium is it was a very large ballroom that was created in the very center, very heart of New York City, right around Times Square, just north of Times Square, where you know the center, kind of the center of New York City. And it really had a very diverse audience who came there. There were Cubans communities of Cubans who lived in New York. There were Puerto Ricans, Italians, African Americans, and Jewish people. And this dance floor became kind of like a United Nations. It was, you are absolutely correct. It was a time when there was a lot of racism. I mean, there still is racism in the United States, but in those days, a lot of the racism was by law. There were places in the southern part of the United States that would have signs for colored only, meaning that, it's very sad to think about, but Black people and white people couldn't drink from the same water fountains. They couldn't go to the same theaters. They couldn't go to the same schools. They had different hospitals. There were hotels that were just for African Americans. So America at the time was very segregated, and there was a lot of anti-Semitism as well. There were hotels that wouldn't let Jewish people stay there. So I'm just telling you this because just to get an understanding of what a special place the Palladium was. because it was a place where people could mix. And as someone said in my film, it didn't matter what color you were, as long as you could dance, you would be accepted. This was a place, and I don't know how many marriages came about between Latinos and Jewish people, or Latinos and Italians, but at least for part of the time, people could mix socially on this dance floor, and they were united by this passion for the dance and the music. And it was a very it was a very different scene there than in the rest of America, where things were, as I say, very, very much separated by race. So the Palladium was a very, very special place, and it was founded by someone who was a survivor of the Holocaust, who had been established. He was a gentleman who worked in the garment trade in New York City, which was an industry, huge industry in New York City. One of the biggest employers in New York City was the garment industry, the fashion industry, and very Jewish, and lots of Jewish people. I would say 80, 90%, as in, if you've seen Mrs. Maisel, you've seen, I forgot his name, but the Mrs. Maisel's husband's father has would be just like Max Hyman. Max Hyman was the founder of the creator of the Palladium. But just like in Mrs. Maisel, Joel, I think Joel's father is one of the moguls in the garment industry. So there were a lot of people who worked in the Jewish people who worked in the garment industry. And after work, Wednesday nights, I interviewed someone who said, well, I went home, I changed into my dress, got back on the subway, and came back down to the center of Manhattan just to dance at the Palladium. So Wednesday and Sunday nights were big nights for dancing. A very big mix of people that you would find there. Very unusual for America at the time.
Perdón. Lex, comentaba que, disculpas, tenemos alguna pregunta de nuestro público que te vamos a trasladar porque son bastante interesantes. Tenemos dos, concretamente de Nubia Sánchez. Pregunta, ¿cuándo va a estar disponible tu documental sobre los Catskills en Estados Unidos? Isabel Cordero nos pregunta o nos dice que quisiera saber si la música latina unida al mambo produjo algún impacto en la música de Elvis Presley.
Wow, that's a very, well, first question first. My film, The Catskills, is coming out this summer. So hopefully I will be able to bring it to Spain at some point after that to be determined. But I would love to. In terms of Elvis Presley and Latin music, I am not so sure it would be Elvis Presley. He was influenced more by African-American music, more by gospel music, music of the church, of the Black or African-American church. However, in New York City, at the time, there was a team of songwriters, Lieber and Stoller, who wrote a lot of the songs. Stand By Me, I think it was Stand By Me. Well, they wrote a lot of music that had that were influenced by some of these Latin rhythms. So if you listen to a group called the Drifters, they are a African-American vocal group from New York City. A lot of their tunes will have a Latin sound to them. And there was a little bit of influence that came in with the Latin music and American popular music at that time. So you can listen to the Drifters, or Ruth Brown is another singer, African-American singer, who was very much influenced by Latin music, who's several songs who very much has a Latin flavor. But Elvis, I would say maybe not so much.
Bueno, no sé si con esto han quedado... luego tenemos más comentarios, Lex, que te animamos a que leas, ¿no? Porque te felicitan y agradecen el poder conocer esta historia gracias a tu testimonio y a tu documental. Así que... Además, también nosotros somos los que estamos agradecidos, Lex, porque has querido participar con nosotros esta tarde en el canal de YouTube del Centro Sefarad-Israel. Te agradecemos enormemente que nos hayas acercado un poco más la historia de estos Catskills neoyorquinos y de la vida en las comunidades judías allí, y esperamos poder tenerte muy pronto por aquí, por España, por Madrid también, para que nos presentes este nuevo documental de Catskills.
I would love to do that. Thank you very much. It's been very fun speaking with you. I hope that you learned. I hope I didn't drone on too much. I hope I hope that this was interesting enough for you. But thank you, and I would love to come to Spain with the Catskills at some point, and maybe the Malbonics too. Who knows?
Pues muchísimas gracias, Lex, y muchísimas gracias también a todas las personas que están conectadas y que nos han seguido esta tarde.